I was sitting on my back porch in Middlebury, Vermont, sipping my morning coffee when I saw her marching across my lawn like she owned the place. Patricia Kelly, the HOA president of our little suburban nightmare called Maple Ridge Estates, was wearing her signature pearl necklace and a scowl that could curdle milk. Behind her trailed a man in an expensive suit carrying a tablet and what appeared to be fabric swatches. "Trevor Thompson," she called out in that grating voice that made my teeth hurt. "We need to discuss the upcoming event." I set down my coffee mug and walked to the edge of the porch, genuinely confused. "What event?" Patricia waved her hand dismissively at my 2-acre property, the one I'd bought specifically because it was the largest lot in the development. "The Hendersons are having their daughter's wedding here in 2 weeks. The ceremony will be on your front lawn and the reception will extend to the back. We've already hired caterers and an event coordinator." I blinked once, twice. "Excuse me?" "It's in the HOA bylaws, section 47, paragraph C," Patricia said, as if she were explaining basic math to a child. "Community spaces can be designated for approved events that benefit the neighborhood's cohesion and property values. Your lawn is the largest in the development, therefore it's the ideal location." "My lawn isn't a community space," I said slowly, feeling my blood pressure rising. "It's my private property. I own it." The man with the tablet stepped forward. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Julian Hendricks, the event coordinator. This is going to be absolutely stunning. We're thinking white tents, string lights, a dance floor right there by those oak trees. The Hendersons are spare no expense kind of people. This will really elevate the entire neighborhood." I looked at Patricia, then at Julian, then back at Patricia. "Get off my property." Patricia's face turned a shade of red that matched the roses I'd planted last spring. "Now you listen here, Trevor. I've been president of this HOA for 7 years, and I know these bylaws inside and out. You signed the agreement when you purchased this home. That signature means you agreed to support community initiatives. Community initiatives like potlucks and charity drives," I shot back. "Not letting strangers use my yard as a wedding venue. The Hendersons aren't strangers. They live 4 houses down. I've never met them in my life." Patricia pulled out her phone and started scrolling. "I'm sending you the relevant bylaw right now. You have 48 hours to comply, or you'll face daily fines of $500. I laughed, an actual genuine laugh, because this had to be some kind of joke. "You can't fine me for not letting people use my private property." "Watch me," Patricia said coldly. She turned to Julian. "Make your measurements. We'll proceed as planned." That's when I stepped off the porch and positioned myself between Julian and my lawn. I said, "Get off my property, both of you now." Julian looked nervous, but Patricia just raised her chin higher. "This is harassment, Trevor. I could report you to the police." "Please do," I said. "While you're at it, explain to them how you're trying to commandeer someone's private property for a wedding." Patricia and Julian left, but not before she shot me a look that promised this wasn't over. I went inside and immediately started digging through the massive folder of HOA documents I'd been given when I bought the house 3 years ago. Section 47, paragraph C did exist, but it referred to actual community spaces like the clubhouse, the pool area, and the small park near the entrance. There was absolutely nothing about using individual homeowners' yards. I called my lawyer, Robert Mills, who I'd worked with during the home purchase. He listened to my story and then groaned. "Trevor, HOAs in Vermont have been getting increasingly aggressive. There was a case last year where an HOA tried to mandate what color curtains people could have. But this is outrageous. Send me everything you have. I'll draft a cease and desist letter." "How fast can you get it to her?" "By tomorrow morning." I felt a small sense of relief, but it didn't last long. That evening, I came home from my job at the engineering firm downtown to find surveyor stakes all over my front lawn. Small flags marked where tents would go, where chairs would be positioned, where the altar would stand. On my front door was a cheerful note on expensive cardstock. "Thank you for supporting the Henderson-Morrison wedding. The community appreciates your generosity. Setup begins June 14th at 6 a.m. Today was June 1st. They were really doing this. I took photos of everything, sent them to Robert, and then spent the next hour pulling up every single stake and flag. I put them in a garbage bag and left it at the end of Patricia's driveway with a note that said, "Return to sender." The next morning, the stakes were back, along with an official HOA violation notice taped to my door. According to Patricia, I was now being fined for removing approved event markers and interfering with community activities. $500 per violation. Robert's cease and desist letter arrived at Patricia's house that afternoon via courier. I know because I watched the delivery from my window. 20 minutes later, my phone rang from an unknown number. "Mr. Thompson, this is Diane Henderson, mother of the bride." The voice was syrupy sweet, but with an edge of steel underneath. "I understand there's been some confusion about the wedding venue." "No confusion," I said. "You're not using my lawn. Mr. Thompson, we've already sent out invitations to 200 guests. The ceremony is in 13 days. We've put deposits down on flowers, catering, musicians, a photographer. Do you have any idea how much money we're talking about? Not my problem. We're offering to compensate you, of course. $5,000 for the day's use of your property. I had to admit, $5,000 would cover a nice vacation. But the principle of the thing, the sheer audacity of them planning an entire wedding on someone's private property without asking, made me see red. Not for $5,000, not for $50,000. Find another venue. There isn't time, Diane said, her voice cracking slightly. Everything is booked this time of year. My daughter's been planning this for 18 months. You're going to ruin her special day. Your lack of planning isn't my emergency. Goodbye, Mrs. Henderson. I hung up and immediately called Robert back. They're not backing down. Neither are we, he assured me. I'm filing an emergency injunction with the county court. They won't be able to set foot on your property for any event purposes. But Trevor, I have to warn you, this is going to get nasty. HOAs like this don't like being challenged. He was right. Over the next week, I found my mailbox stuffed with complaint letters from neighbors I'd barely spoken to. People claiming I was being selfish, that I was ruining a young couple's happiness, that I was damaging property values by refusing to be a team player. Someone left dog feces on my doorstep. My trash cans were knocked over 3 nights in a row. Patricia started showing up at my house daily with different arguments. First it was about community spirit. Then it was about how the wedding would be featured in Vermont Bride magazine, which would bring prestige to Maple Ridge Estates. Then she tried to claim that since I was single and didn't use my entire yard, I should share it with those who needed it more. That last argument almost made me laugh in her face. The injunction hearing was scheduled for June 10th, 4 days before the wedding setup was supposed to begin. I took the day off work and met Robert at the Addison County Courthouse in Middlebury. The Hendersons were there with their lawyer, a sharp-looking woman named Margaret Cross. Patricia was there too, sitting in the front row like she was watching a tennis match. Judge Clarence Winters, a man in his 60s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, reviewed the paperwork carefully. Then he looked up at Margaret. "Counselor, your clients planned an entire wedding on someone else's private property without permission?" Margaret stood. "Your Honor, the property falls under HOA jurisdiction. The bylaws clearly state—" "I've read the bylaws," Judge Winters interrupted. Section 47, paragraph C refers to designated community spaces, of which Mr. Thompson's private residential lot is not one. Do you have any documentation showing that Mr. Thompson agreed to this event? The HOA approval serves as the HOA doesn't own Mr. Thompson's land. He does. Judge Winters turned to me. "Mr. Thompson, just to be clear, you did not give permission for this event?" "No, Your Honor. I found out about it when Mrs. Kelly showed up and told me it was happening." Judge Winters shook his head and signed the injunction. "The Hendersons and any parties associated with their event are hereby prohibited from entering Mr. Thompson's property without his explicit written consent. Mrs. Kelly, you and the HOA are also named in this order. If you violate it, you'll face contempt charges. I suggest the Hendersons find a new venue." The courtroom erupted. Diane Henderson burst into tears. Her daughter, a woman in her late 20s with the same entitled expression as Patricia, started shouting about how her life was ruined. Patricia stood up and declared that this was a miscarriage of justice and she'd be appealing immediately. Judge Winters banged his gavel. "Order, Mrs. Kelly, there's nothing to appeal. Private property rights are pretty straightforward. This hearing is adjourned." I shook Robert's hand and left the courthouse feeling victorious. It was a good feeling but short-lived, because Patricia Kelly wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. That night I got an email from the HOA. My quarterly dues were being increased by 300%, retroactive to January. I also received citations for 17 different violations. My grass was allegedly 1/4 inch too long. My mailbox was not regulation black. My house shutters were fading and unsightly. My driveway had excessive cracks, and the list went on. Each violation carried a $50 daily fine until corrected. I forwarded everything to Robert, who called me within an hour. "This is retaliation, and it's blatant. We can sue for harassment. How long will that take?" "Months, possibly a year or more." I thought about it. I could fight this in court, drag it out, spend thousands in legal fees, and maybe win. Or I could make this so unpleasant for Patricia and the Hendersons that they'd think twice about ever crossing me again. That's when I remembered the septic system. My house was on a septic tank, not city sewer. It was a large system that served my property, and it was due for its regular pump out. I usually scheduled it for late fall, but there was no rule saying I couldn't do it earlier. In fact, I could schedule it for any time I wanted, like say dawn on June 14th. The day the wedding setup was supposed to begin. I called Barker's Septic Service in Middlebury the next morning. "Hey, this is Trevor Thompson out in Maple Ridge Estates. I need to schedule a pump out." "Sure thing, Mr. Thompson. When were you thinking?" "June 14th. Early as possible. Can you do 6 in the morning?" The man on the phone chuckled. Most people don't want us around that early, but yeah, we can do that. It's going to take about 2 hours for a system your size, and it's not going to be quiet or smell pretty. Perfect, I said, grinning. That's exactly what I want. I paid the deposit and marked my calendar. Then I did something that probably wasn't mature but felt absolutely necessary. I printed out copies of the service receipt and the injunction, and I mailed them to Patricia, the Hendersons, and Julian, the event coordinator. The message was clear: my property, my rules, my septic schedule. Patricia showed up at my door within an hour of getting the mail, her face the color of a ripe tomato. You wouldn't dare. It's routine maintenance, I said calmly. My septic system needs to be pumped. I'm a responsible homeowner who follows proper maintenance schedules. You're doing this on purpose, yes, I said. I absolutely am. Because maybe, just maybe, you'll finally understand that you can't steamroll people and expect no consequences. The Hendersons moved the wedding to your lawn anyway, Patricia hissed. We decided you can't be trusted to honor your commitments to this community, so we're proceeding without your cooperation. You can have your little septic truck. We'll work around it. I stared at her in disbelief. You're planning to trespass, even with a court order? We'll see what the judge says when we explain how you're deliberately sabotaging a young couple's happiness. She left before I could respond. I immediately called Robert, who was equally stunned. Trevor, if they violate that injunction, they're going to face serious consequences. But you need to be prepared. Document everything. I'm also going to contact the sheriff's department to give them a heads up. June 14th arrived with clear skies and warm temperatures, perfect wedding weather if you weren't dealing with a septic pump out. I woke up at 5 in the morning, made a large pot of coffee, and waited on my front porch. The Barker's septic service truck arrived at exactly 6 o'clock. It was a massive vehicle with a huge tank and an engine that rumbled like a freight train. The driver, a friendly guy named Marcus, hopped out and gave me a wave. Morning, Mr. Thompson, ready to get this done? Absolutely, I said. Take your time, be thorough. Marcus started setting up, pulling out thick hoses and positioning the truck near the septic access point, which was conveniently located in my front yard. The smell wasn't immediate, but I knew it would be. At 6:15, a white van pulled up across the street. Julian, the event coordinator, stepped out, followed by 2 workers carrying tent poles and equipment. They stopped dead when they saw the septic truck. Julian walked over, covering his nose with his hand. What is this, septic service? I said cheerfully. Routine maintenance. You can't do this today. I can do this any day I want. It's my property. Marcus looked up from his work. Sir, we've got a job to do here. You're going to need to move your van. Julian pulled out his phone and made a call. Within minutes, Patricia's Mercedes came speeding down the street. She parked haphazardly and stormed over, her heels sinking slightly into my lawn. Stop this immediately, she demanded. Marcus straightened up, confused. Madam, we're contracted to pump this septic system. We're not stopping. I'm the HOA president and I'm ordering you to leave. Lady, you're not my boss and this isn't your property. We're doing our job. The smell was starting to intensify as Marcus worked the pumps. It was the distinctive gag-inducing aroma of raw sewage, and it was spreading across the lawn like an invisible fog. Julian and his workers retreated to the van, looking green. Patricia pulled out her phone. I'm calling the police. Please do, I said, leaning back in my porch chair. I'll wait. She did call them, and Officer Bradley Stevens from the Middlebury Police Department arrived about 20 minutes later. By this time, the smell was overpowering, and more vendor trucks had started arriving for the wedding setup. They were all parked on the street, no one willing to get too close to the septic operation. Officer Stevens approached me first, notepad in hand. Mr. Thompson, I understand there's a dispute here. I handed him copies of the injunction and the septic service contract. No dispute on my end, officer. I'm having routine maintenance done on my septic system, which is my right as a property owner. These people are trying to set up a wedding on my lawn without my permission, which violates a court order. Officer Stevens read through the documents carefully. Then he walked over to Patricia, who was surrounded by Julian, the Hendersons, and about a dozen frustrated-looking vendors. Mrs. Kelly, I have an injunction here that says you're not allowed on this property. That injunction is under appeal, Patricia said quickly. No, it's not, Officer Stevens said. I checked before I came out. There's no appeal filed. You're in violation of a court order. I'm going to need everyone to clear off Mr. Thompson's property right now. Diane Henderson stepped forward, mascara running down her cheeks. Officer, my daughter's wedding is today. The ceremony is supposed to start at 2 o'clock. We have 200 guests coming. You can't do this. Madam, I'm sorry about your situation, but Mr. Thompson has a legal right to refuse use of his property. You need to find an alternative location. There is no alternative location, Diane shrieked. Everything is booked. The invitations went out months ago. Officer Stevens looked genuinely sympathetic, but he shook his head. That's not Mr. Thompson's fault. You need to leave his property, all of you, or I'll have to start issuing citations for trespassing. The argument continued for another 30 minutes, with Diane crying, her daughter screaming at me from the street, and Patricia threatening legal action against everyone from me to the septic company to Officer Stevens himself. But eventually they started packing up the vans. The vendors left, shaking their heads and complaining about wasted time. Marcus finished the pump out around 8:30. The smell would linger for hours, maybe the whole day. He packed up his equipment and handed me a receipt. "That was the most dramatic septic job I've ever done," he said. "Good luck with your neighbors." "Thanks," I said, handing him a generous tip. "You did great work." I thought that was the end of it. The wedding was canceled, Patricia was humiliated, and I'd made my point about property rights. But at around noon I noticed cars starting to line the street, lots of cars. Wedding guests were arriving. I walked to the end of my driveway and saw that they'd set up the entire wedding in the small community park at the development's entrance. It was a half-acre patch of grass with a gazebo, meant for kids to play in. Folding chairs were crammed together, a makeshift altar was positioned under the gazebo, and caterers were frantically setting up tables in what little space remained. It looked cramped and chaotic and absolutely miserable, especially with the afternoon heat rising. But credit to the Hendersons, they were making it work. I went back inside, feeling a mix of satisfaction and something else I couldn't quite name. Maybe a tiny bit of guilt? But no, I reminded myself. They'd tried to steal my property. They'd violated a court order. They'd harassed me for weeks. They deserved this. That evening, after the wedding was over and the guests had left, Patricia appeared at my door one final time. She looked exhausted, her makeup smudged, her signature pearls crooked. "I hope you're happy," she said quietly. "I'm satisfied," I replied. "There's a difference. The Hendersons are talking about suing you for what? Maintaining my septic system? Enforcing my property rights? Tell them to go ahead, I'll see them in court." Patricia straightened her pearls. "You've made an enemy of this HOA, Trevor. We won't forget this." "Good," I said, "because I won't either. And the next time you try to overstep your authority, I'll remind you what happens." She left without another word. I closed the door, poured myself a bourbon, and sat on my back porch watching the sunset over my very private, very empty lawn. But the story didn't end there, not by a long shot. The following Monday, I received official notice that the HOA was placing a lien on my property for unpaid fines totaling $17,000. According to their calculations, I owed money for all those bogus violations Patricia had cited, plus interest and administrative fees. Robert nearly exploded when I showed him the documents. "This is beyond harassment now. This is fraud. We're countersuing for malicious prosecution, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I'm also filing a formal complaint with the state about HOA abuse." The legal process moved slowly, but things in Maple Ridge Estates moved fast. Patricia started targeting other homeowners with the same aggressive fine tactics she'd used on me. The Martins got cited for having a vegetable garden that was allegedly unsightly. The Chens were fined for parking their hybrid car on the street overnight instead of in their garage. The Williams family got violations for their kids' chalk drawings on their driveway. People started talking. By July, a coalition had formed. Homeowners who were sick of Patricia's authoritarian rule. They asked me to attend a meeting at the Martinez home, a couple in their 40s who'd lived in Maple Ridge for a decade. "Trevor, we need your help," Carlos Martinez said as about 15 neighbors crowded into his living room. "Patricia's out of control. She's fining everyone for everything. We want to remove her as HOA president, but we need someone to lead the charge." I looked around at the tired, frustrated faces. These were good people who just wanted to live their lives without constant harassment. "What do you need from me?" "We need you to run for HOA president," said Linda Williams, a schoolteacher with 3 kids. "The election is in September. If we can get enough votes, we can remove Patricia and fix this mess." I'd never wanted to be involved in HOA politics. Hell, I actively avoided it. But looking at these people, thinking about Patricia's reign of terror, I realized someone had to stand up. "Okay," I said. "I'll run." The campaign was brutal. Patricia spread rumors that I was trying to destroy the neighborhood, that I'd bring down property values, that I was vindictive and petty. She sent out mass emails painting me as the villain who'd ruined a beautiful wedding. She even got the Hendersons to write a letter to every homeowner describing how I'd sabotaged their daughter's special day. But we fought back. My coalition went door to door, talking to homeowners about Patricia's abuse of power, showing them the bogus fines, explaining how HOAs were supposed to protect property values, not extort residents. We held town halls at the community clubhouse. We created a website documenting every overreach, every illegal fine, every threat Patricia had made. The Hendersons' letter actually backfired. When people heard the full story, how they'd tried to commandeer my private property without asking, how they'd violated a court injunction, many sided with me. Turns out most people valued property rights over entitled behavior. Election day was September 15th. The voting took place at the clubhouse, and turnout was the highest in Maple Ridge history. Every homeowner seemed to understand that this election would determine what kind of community they lived in. Patricia gave a speech about tradition, order, and maintaining standards. I gave a speech about respect, fairness, and following the actual law instead of made-up rules. When the votes were counted that evening, I won by a margin of 73-28. Patricia Kelly was no longer HOA president. She didn't take it well. She stormed out of the clubhouse without conceding, got in her Mercedes, and drove off with her tires squealing. But the next morning, per HOA rules, she had to hand over all records, files, and accounts to me. What I found was shocking. Patricia had been embezzling HOA funds for years. The quarterly dues everyone paid were supposed to go toward maintenance, landscaping, and community improvements. But Patricia had been funneling money into a separate account, using it for personal expenses. There were charges for luxury spa treatments, designer clothes, expensive dinners. She'd even used HOA money to pay for part of the Henderson wedding setup. The total embezzlement added up to over $90,000 across 3 years. I called an emergency meeting with Robert and the HOA board. We agreed we had no choice. This wasn't just abuse of power anymore. This was criminal. We filed a police report with the Middlebury Police Department. Detective Sarah Brennan took the case, and after reviewing the financial records, she agreed there was probable cause for charges. On October 3rd, Patricia Kelly was arrested at her home for embezzlement and fraud. The arrest was early morning, and several neighbors watched as she was led out in handcuffs, her face pale and shocked. For once, she had nothing to say. The criminal case moved through the system. Patricia tried to claim the money was for legitimate HOA expenses, but the receipts told a different story. Designer handbags aren't community improvements. Neither are luxury vacations or high-end jewelry. In January, she pleaded guilty to multiple counts of embezzlement and fraud. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 months. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA. Though her lawyer argued she didn't have the money, her house went up for sale to cover the debt. The Hendersons moved out of Maple Ridge Estates in November, quietly and without fanfare. I heard through the neighborhood gossip that the marriage had already hit rough patches, possibly from all the stress and drama. I felt a small twinge of sympathy for the daughter, who'd been caught up in her parents' entitled behavior, but not much. As the new HOA president, I made sweeping changes. I rewrote the bylaws to include clear checks and balances, eliminated bogus fines, and established a transparent budgeting process. I created a committee system where no single person had absolute power. I also made sure every homeowner understood their actual rights versus what the HOA could legally enforce. The transformation was remarkable. Maple Ridge Estates went from a neighborhood ruled by fear and arbitrary rules to a real community. People started talking to each other again. Kids played in the park without worry that their parents would get fined. The community pool became a gathering place instead of a source of citations. I served as HOA president for 2 years. In that time, we used the recovered embezzlement funds to make real improvements. Repaving the community roads, upgrading the playground equipment, installing better lighting throughout the development. We even built a proper community pavilion that could be reserved for events. No private property seizure required. When my term ended, I didn't run for re-election. I'd done what I set out to do, fixed the system and restored sanity. A retired teacher named Margaret O'Brien took over, and she continued the work of running the HOA fairly and transparently. Life returned to normal, or as normal as it gets. I kept my job at the engineering firm, enjoyed my quiet evenings on my back porch, and took satisfaction in my perfectly maintained lawn that remained entirely private and entirely mine. Sometimes on warm summer evenings, I'd see wedding photos pop up on social media from couples who'd rented the new community pavilion. They looked happy, the venue looked nice, and most importantly, nobody's property rights were violated in the process. I learned a lot from the whole ordeal. I learned that HOAs can be forces for good or instruments of tyranny depending on who's running them. I learned that property rights matter, even when defending them makes you unpopular. I learned that standing up to bullies, even when it's hard and messy and complicated, is worth it. And I learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't elaborate or cruel. Sometimes it's just scheduling routine septic maintenance at exactly the right time and letting the consequences unfold naturally. The smell from that June morning had long since faded from my lawn, but the memory remained crystal clear. Every time I saw the septic access point in my front yard, I couldn't help but grin a little. It was a reminder that sometimes the most mundane, ordinary acts of homeownership could be revolutionary. Patricia served her time and was released from prison in June of the following year. She didn't return to Maple Ridge Estates. I heard she moved somewhere in New Hampshire to live with a sister. Her reputation and her reign of HOA terror permanently ended. The Hendersons' daughter got divorced after just 14 months of marriage. I felt genuinely sorry about that. despite everything. The wedding drama probably hadn't helped their relationship, though I suspected there were deeper issues. Still, I hoped she found happiness eventually. Maybe with someone whose parents understood boundaries. As for me, I eventually met someone. Her name was Rachel, and she was an architect who appreciated both good design and good property law. When I told her the story of the HOA wedding war on our third date, she laughed so hard she nearly spit out her wine. "You scheduled a septic pump out?" she gasped between laughs. "That's brilliant." "It was necessary home maintenance," I said with mock seriousness. "It was petty revenge at its finest, maybe a little of both." We got married 2 years later in October at a beautiful vineyard in the Champlain Valley. My lawn remained wedding-free exactly as I preferred it, though Rachel did joke that if we ever renewed our vows, we should do it on our property just to prove we could. The legal case against the HOA for their harassment and illegal fines was settled out of court. The HOA's insurance company paid a substantial sum to avoid trial, and those funds were distributed among all the homeowners who'd been unfairly fined. It wasn't a fortune, but it was justice. Robert Mills became a good friend through all of this. We still grab lunch occasionally, and he never tires of telling other lawyers about the septic system defense case. It apparently became something of a legend in local property law circles. Marcus from Barker's Septic Service still handles my regular pump-outs, though we schedule them in the fall now like normal people. He always asks if there are any weddings to disrupt, and I always laugh and say no. The community park where the Henderson wedding eventually took place got a complete renovation thanks to the recovered embezzlement funds. It's actually quite nice now, with proper facilities and designated event areas. Several couples have gotten married there since, all properly scheduled and permitted. I attended one of those weddings for the Chenz's son, and it was lovely. Standing there watching the ceremony, I thought about how different things could have been. If Patricia had just approached me respectfully and asked if I'd be willing to host a wedding, maybe I would have said yes. If the Hendersons had offered fair compensation and treated me like a human being instead of an obstacle, maybe we could have worked something out. But they didn't. They tried to take what wasn't theirs, to bulldoze over my rights because they believed their wants mattered more than my property. And that's where they went wrong. Sometimes I wonder if Patricia ever thinks about it, sitting in her sister's house in New Hampshire. Does she realize that all of this, the arrest, the conviction, the public humiliation, could have been avoided if she'd just respected basic property rights and stopped embezzling? Does she understand that her downfall wasn't caused by me but by her own arrogance and greed? Probably not. People like Patricia rarely accept responsibility for their actions. They're always the victim in their own story, always convinced that the rules don't apply to them, that they're special and different and above the law. But the law doesn't care about your self-perception. Property rights don't bend because you want them to, and sometimes justice comes in the form of a septic truck at dawn. My lawn is beautiful these days. I hired a professional landscaping company to maintain it, and it's probably the best-looking yard in all of Maple Ridge Estates. The oak trees that Julian wanted to hang lights from have grown fuller and healthier. The roses bloom every spring without fail. The grass is thick and green and precisely maintained, and it's all mine, every square foot of it. No weddings, no events, no HOA president trying to claim authority over something she has no right to control. That's not selfishness. That's ownership. That's the fundamental American right to property that this country was built on. And I'll defend it every time, whether it's against an entitled bride, an embezzling HOA president, or anyone else who thinks they can take what's not theirs. The story became something of a legend in Middlebury. I still get stopped at the grocery store occasionally by people who've heard about it. They always want to know if it's true, if I really scheduled a septic pump out to stop a wedding. I always confirm that yes, it's true, every word of it. Some people think I was cruel. They see the photos of the cramped wedding at the park and feel sorry for the couple. But those people don't understand the principle at stake. This was never about ruining a wedding. It was about refusing to let people treat me like a doormat, about standing up for my rights even when it was inconvenient for others. And honestly, the wedding happened. It was cramped and chaotic and not what the Hendersons envisioned, but their daughter got married. She said her vows, her guests celebrated, and everyone went home. The only difference was that it happened on community property that was actually available for use rather than on my private lawn. The compromise that should have been the plan from the beginning. I still live in Maple Ridge Estates. I still serve on the HOA board as an advisor, making sure we never slide back into the Patricia Kelly era of tyranny and embezzlement. The neighborhood has become the kind of community I hoped it would be when I first bought my house. Friendly but not invasive, well-maintained but not obsessively controlled. And on quiet evenings when I'm sitting on my back porch with Rachel, sipping bourbon and watching the sunset over our private beautiful wedding-free lawn, I think about that morning in June when I stood my ground, when I refused to be bullied, when I used the most mundane tool available to me, routine septic maintenance, to defend my property rights. It was petty, sure, it was probably a little mean, but it was also necessary, effective, and completely legal. And that septic truck rumbling into my driveway at dawn remains one of the most satisfying moments of my entire life.